Hey everyone! So, I've been meaning to get around to making this for a while now, but I've just been prioritizing other things, and at the time I just didn't want to. But at least I'm doing it now, and I don't leave this incomplete. I'm going to say this right now. All the end game portions of BBCAN are kind of lackluster. So one season being very high and another season being very low generally doesn't mean much. I think some BBUS seasons generally have a lot more exciting end games, but overall, end games aren't exciting since usually things are so set in stone and you can predict who are going to make it to the end and who will win almost immediately. At 8 is Big Brother Canada 3. I didn't like how some of the twists in the mid portion kind of deterred what happened in the end game, and essentially it was everyone versus Ashley for the most part, which wasn't interesting to me at all. There isn't much notable about the end game of the season. Sarah wins HOH and nominates Zach and Ashley to be put on the block. I don't really remember who was the target at this point of the season, but Ashley won the veto and Zach's goose is obviously cooked when Pilar is the replacement nominee. It is a double eviction, and most of the house wants Ashley gone. Brittany wins the next HOH and puts up the final two members of the opposite side on the block, meaning Ashley and Pilar. Once again, Ashley wins the veto, Godfrey is the replacement, and Pilar is sent home. Sarah wins HOH again and nominates Ashley and Godfrey for eviction. Everyone wants Ashley gone yet again, but she wins the veto again. Due to this, Brittany has to go up and Ashley makes the obvious move of sending Brittany home. Everyone in the final three are very individualistic and there's no solid alliance between any of them. So, winning the final HOH was important and it was kind of cool to see. Godfrey, who isn't known for competition, ends up winning the final HOH and evicts Ashley, which is definitely questionable, but he could have lost against her anyways. Nothing notable pertaining the final two whatsoever. Sarah was always going to win in a wash, and of course she did here. The jury didn't see Godfrey's game, and allegedly, some of them were annoyed with Bruno's heavy campaigning for Godfrey in the jury house. At number 7 is BBCAN 6, and I personally feel like everything from the other two portions of the season had the season peaking, so by the time we got to the end game, it was just very boring and dry. There really wasn't much to invest in for me personally. The final 5 had Kayla win the HOH, and she obviously nominates Maddie and Paris. The only notable moment I remember about the end game is Derek convincing Will to leave the veto comp, though Will was the only one person who could save all 3 of him and his allies that round, to boot Derek. Kayla ends up winning the veto, she doesn't use it, and there is some uncomfortable gaslighting of Maddie, who is sent home here. Paris starts winning competitions finally as she becomes the new HOH. Of course, she obviously nominates Kayla and Derek, but it ultimately doesn't matter, as Kayla wins the final 4 veto, and despite all the talk she made about cutting Derek, which got very annoying, she sends Will home here. We get even more talk about Kayla wanting to cut Derek, and I just didn't give a crap about it, and it didn't even matter in the grand scheme of things, since Paris was the only one who ended up winning the final competition, and she obviously boots Derek. The final 2 jury questioning was not interesting at all, but that's mainly due to the format. What made it even worse for me was that all of them felt like yelling and cringy speeches that Kayla and Paris created at the end just really grinded my gears. I just wanted to clog my ears. It was just completely awful, and it was one of the most uncomfortable final 2 questionings I've ever experienced. At number 6 is BBCAN 2. Honestly, I just felt like the season's kind of overrated, and going through these sections just strengthening that opinion for me. But it was a bit more interesting due to one moment than I was expecting. Adele wins the HOH and nominates the 2 outsiders in Rachel and Sabrina. I don't recall or really care if it was this week or the next week when he was arguing with Sabrina quite a bit. Overall, this week wasn't notable, since Netta won the veto, didn't use it, and the goat Sabrina is kept over Rachel. John becomes the next HOH and decides to nominate Heather and Sabrina, as he wanted to get rid of Heather. Those plans are thwarted when she wins the veto, and he's essentially forced to send home Adele, as he was not comfortable with targeting Netta at this point. Just kinda an round overall. In a huge shocker that actually made the season more interesting at this point pertaining its endgame, Sabrina pulls out an HOH win, meaning that the majority alliance would have to eat one of their own, but it wasn't as big of a deal since that process started with the last round. Heather and John are nominated, John wins the veto and sends Heather home, who becomes somewhat teary-eyed. So we have the final three fighting for the final HOH, and it becomes clear that John and Netta are planning to cut one another. So when John won the final HOH and cut her, it was a cool moment, I'm not even going to lie, since everyone thought that Netta had it in their bag, but it was just snatched from under her, from the one person that everyone thought wouldn't do it to her throughout the entire season. Nothing to really note pertaining to the final two. Everyone knew John was going to win, Sabrina was going to lose, nothing interesting pertaining to jury questioning happened, and it was a landslide. At 5 is BBCAN 5, and I didn't intend this to happen pertaining the pun overall. By this point, it was kind of obvious it was just about who was going to win the competitions between Kevin and Dimitri, and it was obvious that Kevin was going to come out on top due to the way he studied even before the season. Kevin wins the HOH again, which was predictable at this point since Dimitri was out going HOH, and nominates the showmans, Dimitri and Aika, once again. Because he wanted to make some ridiculously huge move and to look like a mastermind, he vetoes Aika after she and Dimitri pranked his room and put up Dylan. It was fun seeing them kind of like clean up their mess after he saved her, but whatever. Because Karen for some reason wanted Dimitri to win over her, she voted out Dylan. I guess it was kind of cool to see the showman survive the block twice, but it didn't really matter since we knew what was going to happen next. The final 4 round was pretty boring since it was clear that Dimitri and Kevin were going to win all the competitions. Dimitri won HOH, nominated Karen and Kevin, but none of that mattered because Kevin won the veto, unsurprisingly, and evicted Aika, unsurprisingly. By this point, and even in the last several rounds, it was clear that Kevin was going to win out, and there was no more gameplay to be had, since essentially the triple. It was all about who was going to win the comps, and Karen was automatically out for that, and it was obvious that Kevin would win and boot Dimitri. The final 2 was just a Kevin praise session, and there was nothing interesting about the jury questioning. Karen wasn't even grilled or anything, despite being a 0-vote finalist. A pretty boring endgame to a great season. At number 4 is BBCAN 1, and the main reason why it's ranked here is because of one moment that happens at the very, very, very end, and I think you all know what that is. And I do think there's a few more interesting dynamics compared to some of the others that I ranked below it. So, we are at the second double eviction of the season, and it's clear that a steamroll is in progress. Emmett wins HOH, and nominates Tala to pawn against Topaz. Peter wins the veto, but because he never valued Topaz as an ally or a player, and still thinks that Emmett is his ally and on his side, he was talked into not using the veto and Topaz is sent home. Jillian wins a consecutive HOH after being dethroned, so her alliance is essentially safe again, as long as Peter doesn't win the veto. Andrew and Peter are nominated. Andrew is pissed off that he was nominated instead of Tala, and it makes Emmett distrust him, but he wins the veto and Tala is nominated as the replacement. Tala and Andrew start to argue quite a lot during this round and going into the next round. Peter did this weird thing as he was being evicted and no one cared. Emmett wins a consecutive HOH and Gary comes back, turning what would have been the final 4 into the final 5 because he was voted in. I still can't get over how crappy of a twist this is, even 9 years later. Emmett nominated Andrew and Gary, but he wanted Gary to save himself, So when Tala was nominated as the replacement, Andrew didn't see his demise coming, while arguing with Tala a lot as well and being mad because he feels like Tala should be evicted over him. I forgot how entitled Andrew was until recapping and going back into the season. Jillian continues with her consecutive HOH streak and nominates the two people that was not her showmance in Gary and Tala. Emmett wins the veto, and because Gary is more likely to take him in Emmett's point of view and is less close to Jillian compared to Tala, Emmett evicts Tala instead. Nothing to really discuss pertaining to the final three, though there are some people who claim that Dan's discussion with Gary caused for him to gut Emmett, where he might not have done so otherwise. Child, the final two is arguably the main thing that stands out about this endgame, where Topaz accidentally votes for Jillian to win, while she's trying to make a petty speech that would cause Jillian to lose. Aressa will forever remind the jurors to vote for the winner because of Topaz. At the same time, I'm glad because the Shield made this very obnoxious pack against Jillian in the jury house, and even Emmett, since they felt like supporting him meant supporting Jillian. At number 3 is BBCAN 7. Yeah, so this isn't last since I usually rank the season dead last in everything. But I will say enjoy it while it lasts because I highly doubt BBCAN 7 will rank high on anything else on any of my lists ever again. The endgame starts with a double eviction and it's as boring as the entire season up to this point. Dane wins HOH, nominates Damien and Kyra. Anthony wins his first competition ever and keeps the nominations the same. Damien leaves the house as clueless as he was when he entered it and as he played throughout the entire season. The one interesting thing that happens with an HOH result is that Kyra won the HOH competition in the final 5, meaning that right before the final 4, the 4 Alliance Pretty Boys will have to finally be split up. Kyra really didn't give a crap and nominated Adam and Dane on the block. It caused for a few arguments that happened in the house as they turned on one another. Right when they were planning on booting him, Adam won the veto, and Anthony was able to convince Kyra to nominate Mark. Dane should have been dead in the water, but he was able to convince Anthony and Adam to keep him, so the expendable Mark is booted. Dane unsurprisingly wins the final 4 HOH, and he intends to go to the final 2 with Anthony, so he nominates Adam and Kyra. This entire time, Adam thinks that Kyra is going to be evicted, and that strengthens when Dane wins the veto. Anthony tells Adam that he's evicting him, and I was just dying of laughter as Adam was crying, because he prioritized this alliance over his own individual gain, and I felt like it was kind of karma, and I just thought it was ridiculous. The final 3 was just whatever at this point, as it was clear that Dane was going to win the final HOH competition. Kyra was lucky to have made it as far as they did, and the two guys were going to take one another to the end. Once again, the final 2 part was boring as hell, since the jury format sucks, and it was clear that the jury was jerking off Dane. Him winning in a 7-0 fashion was not shocking whatsoever, though Anthony deserved a few votes. So, at number 2 is BBCAN 4. That I'm breaking down each period of each season, I'm coming to realize more and more that this season is very underrated, as there's always some stuff happening in each portion of the season, which I can't say for some of the others, and it's almost always kept my interest. So we are in the middle of a double eviction, and the brothers win the HOH competition. How they probably switch the competitions is another story for another time. They nominate Tim and Nikki, since Cassandra promised them that she would not use the veto if she won. Cassandra actually wins the veto for once, which is shocking, and uses it on Tim. The Paquettes lose their mind on live TV and wants to quit the show, but Aressa tells them to sit down. Joel is nominated, and Nikki, rest in peace to her, is sent home. Kelsey wins the HOH, and she makes the obvious move in nominating Tim and Cassandra. There was a huge fight that involved Cassandra, Kelsey, and the Paquettes, and kind of Tim, if I remember correctly, and Tim won the veto. It seemed like they were thinking about sending Cassandra home, but something along the way caused things to change, as Joel started to poorly campaign and he ended up going home instead. Nothing notable about the Final Four round. The Paquettes won HOH, nominated Tim and Cassandra, won the veto, and decided to evict Cassandra with Kelsey's vote. I remember her begging Tim to quit for her, and he wouldn't do that, but that was pretty cringy on her part. What is there to even say about the final three? Kelsey and the Paquettes, who have been doing well in the last set of competitions, shut Tim out by the final part, so no matter what, Tim, who claims to have quit for contractual reasons, though he just gave up in part 2, was evicted. Boring, but not unusual for final threes. Going to the final 2, I just found Kelsey and the Paquette's answers to be very poor, as well as the speeches, but that's probably because they didn't have the best read on the game and how to promote their game. At least it was more entertaining than the other final 2s, just because I could laugh at them, but it wasn't cringe like Kayla and Paris' performances in BBCAN 6. So at number 1 is BBCAN 9. While I think the season was exciting from start to end, hence it having the best endgame portion, it still wasn't as exciting as the other 2 portions of the season, pertaining the pre-jury and the early to mid-jury portion. Tara wins HOH and wants to make a huge move, so she nominates the showmans in Beth and Jedson. Things seem like they would go the typical route when Jedson wins the veto, as he would take himself off and Beth would go home. But he decides to veto Beth with the encouragement of his allies. Brayden is nominated and Jed thinks that he's going to stay, but he doesn't realize that Kiefer and Tyshawn are planning to send him home, and it's great. It wasn't even like he was engaged to her like Brendan in BB13 or related like Evil Dick in Season 8, who both made similar moves. It ends up being a double eviction where Tyshawn wins HOH and nominates Beth and Tara. Brendan wins his first veto ever, first competition in general actually, and keeps nominations the same. Tara is sent home, but the double ends up being a fake double, a la BBCAN 4, but instead they have to compete to get back into the house. Tara ends up winning her way back into the house, and I think that result was for the better, since I made Jen's that fall to be a lot more solidified and final. Brayden wins HOH and nominates Beth and Tara for eviction. He then wins his 3rd competition in a row as he wins the veto to keep it the same. I remember Beth and Tyshawn arguing a lot during this time, and while it was kind of entertaining, it wasn't good during management, but the week was not as exciting as the last one since Beth is obviously dead in the water. The final 4 was kind of whatever in my opinion. Tyshawn wins HOH, nominates Kiefer and Tara for eviction. Tara wins the veto, but I don't remember if she was the target for the week anyways. Brayden has no choice but to go up, but Tara evicts Kiefer. It was obvious that Tyshawn and Brayden were going to take one another to the final 2, and they were more successful than Tara in competitions at this point, so Tyshawn wins the final HOH and evicting her, which wasn't shocking, and I was proud of it, since I didn't want to see someone evicted prior winning the season. Nothing notable about the final 2 whatsoever. Brayden was obviously going to lose, but he didn't get tough questions or pull much of a performance, and it was obvious that Tyshawn was going to win the season. So that is how I rank the endgames of BBCAN, and how I rank each portion of each BBCAN season. So my current thought on BBCAN 10 was, I do think it's a good season, but I don't like it as much as many other people do. Something about it just kind of like flatlined as the season went on and on. But overall, it's still a good season and much better than US.